Good afternoon and good morning to all, depending on your time zone. And thank you very much for being with us today. I'm Xavier Pasco. I'm the director of the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, Foundation for Strategic Research here in Paris. And we're very happy to welcome you all for this event, intended to debate about this new Transatlantic Security Agenda. At the moment of important changes and maybe challenges. I would like to thank, obviously, our speakers, Elbridge, Colby, and Bart Szewczyk, for being with us today, as well as our discussant, Mrs. Carisa Nietsche. Thank you very much for this debate. I won't take more time because we're going to have an intense discussion for 1 hour. We need to reserve time for this. Before that, I would like to thank very much also the US Embassy here in Paris for the support for supporting this event. And I will give the floor to Mark Turner, Mr. Counselor for Public Affairs, for a few words or so, and then I will give the floor back to François, who is Special Advisor at the FRS, and I will be the chair for this session. So Mark, the floor is yours for a few remarks.
Over to you, Mark.
Sure. Thank you, Xavier, and good afternoon. Or good morning, as you said. The U.S. Embassy is proud to partner with the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique to present today's webinar. Today is the first in a series of conversations on transatlantic defense and security issues sponsored by the U.S. Embassy in France. Over the past few weeks, President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken have laid out this administration's approach to national security, reinforcing the central role diplomacy will play in our foreign policy. And the President and Secretary have identified the key priorities in our national security strategy, which includes, obviously, COVID-19, the economic recovery, climate change, how to deal with an adversarial relationship with both China and Russia. But central to our success on any of these challenges is revitalizing our ties with our allies and partners, because we recognize we won't be able to achieve anything if we try to go it alone. And the President's message to the world is clear. Not only is America back, but the transatlantic relationship is more essential now than ever before. Frankly put, the United States needs Europe and vice versa if we're able to rise to the challenges, to meet the challenges of today's complex world. And one of the strengths of the Franco-American partnership is the vibrant exchange that exists between international security practitioners, analysts, and academics. We hope that today's event and this series will bring unique American voices to French audiences in order to further strengthen our shared interests. We also value the role FRS plays in bringing together American and French experts in conversations that contribute to a better understanding between our two countries. Xavier, thank you for this partnership, and I look forward to today's discussion with our excellent panelists. Back to you, François. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for setting the scene. Just a few words about our conversation. I'll first bring in Bart Szewczyk, whom a number of you have already met, at least virtually, including myself. We'll then move over to Elbridge Colby, who will maybe also say a few words about the Marathon Initiative, for those who are not familiar with it. And to discuss, we'll have Carisa Nietsche from the Center for a New American Security. We have 186 people signed up for this discussion. 78 of them are currently online. I'll ask each three of you to go for 10 minutes. I'll maybe chip in with a question or comment of my own after each one of your interventions. And once we've done that, we'll turn towards the group of participants. I will ask them to insert their questions or comments into the chat part of the screen so that I can collect the questions and put them to our panelists. Thank you all. Thank you for being with us. And thank you to our panelists in particular, and to the US Embassy for having made this possible. So Bart, over to you.
Thanks very much, François. Actually, we were discussing with Bridge that it might make sense for him to go first, given his most recent experience with the Trump administration. So if it's okay with you as our chair and maestro, I'll turn it over first to Bridge and then follow up with some remarks.
So Elbridge, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, François. Thank you to FRS and to the embassy for the kind invitation to Xavier and Mark. In particular, it's a pleasure to be on with both Bart and Carisa. Look forward to seeing everybody, and of course to visiting Paris very, very soon after this awful pandemic. But I hope everyone online is well. I think this is a very timely topic. Obviously, there's a lot of talk, kind of a lot of froth out there, but I think it's actually a really consequential point in international politics in general. And I think we're going to see, in a sense, that the Biden administration is pursuing that I'll break down a little bit. And I think the U.S.-French relationship is going to be particularly important, not just in the context of what the Biden administration is doing, but I continue to think that there is a profound potential alignment between what America is heading towards and what is at least compatible with President Macron's statements and vision. I don't think what he's saying, with all due respect, is compatible at this point, but I think maybe pruned a little bit on both sides. There's a very deep alignment that actually could be the basis for really strong axis across the Atlantic between Washington and Paris. So what am I getting at? I mean, I think it's very clear now that the United States recognizes that China is the priority challenge for the United States. As Nancy Pelosi said last year, well, in the last in-person Munich Security Conference, that was the thing she agreed with President Trump on, which was saying something. And I think you see now with the Biden administration coming in, that they clearly see the threat. I mean, I have to commend their clarity. They're really not pulling their punches that China is a very, very serious challenge. So I applaud them for that. There are obviously differences, both across the spectrum and within parties about how to do that. Whether Asia should be the focus or it's a global competition, how much of the balance between hard and soft power is relevant. These are all important issues, but I do think it's very clear that pretty much everybody is on board that we need to continue, essentially. I mean, as Secretary Blinken said, we need to continue the Trump administration's tough line towards China, that we're just at the beginning of this. And of course, President Biden's vision and is one that's much more engaged with allies, although I might quibble with fairness, but this is politics. It's all fair in love and war. And diplomacy, politics, but I think that really leaves the question of how do we do that? I mean, we know that China is a fifth of global GDP and growing. The pandemic has probably accelerated that in the short term, although we'll see. Obviously, China has a lot of internal issues, but the Eurozone's recovery is going to be slow. Emerging markets sound like they're going to be slow. So China isn't fading. It's going to be a very, very serious competitor. And in fact, it's the most powerful state the United States has faced since the USSR, and it's the most powerful state to enter the international system since the United States itself in the late 19th century, really. So we're dealing with a very serious challenge. Now, I think there are at least two basic models. There may be others. I'm sure there are, but two ones that I see right now. The Biden administration's, as I think Mark eloquently put it, the Biden administration's approach is what I would term, and I'm going to try to lay this out in an article for the National Interest magazine in the next issue, is something like a very democracy-oriented or kind of more of an ideological approach and global in nature. And I'll unpack that in a second. The alternative, which is kind of my view, is a more threat-based approach that looks to align with countries where their interests are directly engaged and where their capabilities are most directly useful, but has a distinctly less global and less ideological. In fact, it's essentially very more regional in many ways. So I think what I see the Biden administration's approach being, and I think if you look at President Biden's speech at the Munich Security Conference, at the State Department, at the Pentagon, if you look at Secretary Blinken's rhetoric, and if you look at the interim national security strategy guidance, I mean, I don't think the president could be any clearer how central he thinks the role of democracy is. And it has domestic implications in the United States, not implications, but domestic connection there. But I think looking at it from the international political vantage point, he's very clearly saying that democracies must stick together, and similarly Secretary Blinken with techno-democracies versus techno-authoritarianism. Democracies are expected to align together and against the authoritarians. And actually, I thought President Biden he said that Russia is just as much of a threat as China at the Munich Security Conference. So while China is clearly a challenge in the Biden administration's lens, it's not the only one. In fact, I don't think we've had such a liberal hawk kind of inflected administration rhetoric, certainly since the Clinton administration, maybe since the Kennedy administration in some ways. I mean, I think it's a real clarion call that we've seen in the opening months. And I think it's very clear that comes clearly from the president and the top leadership. So I think the logic here is, I mean, we know there's a huge growing challenge from China. Just look at what Admiral Davidson said yesterday on the Hill, our Pacific commander. So we know there's a huge problem. We know they're throwing around their weight, Australia, Europe now, Taiwan, pineapples, et cetera. Okay, so the way that I think the Biden administration is planning to balance is you work closely with democracies. Now, there are democracies in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, special case. But most of Asia, certainly South and Southeast Asia, is at best in a liberal democracy or non-democratic. So by logical deduction, I think they've made it clear, the transatlantic relationship will be central. And I think the fact that the president gave that speech at Munich with such force suggests that there is a very high expectation for Europe. And many of us have been seeing that over the last couple of months. So I think that the upshot for countries in Europe is more will be asked of them. And of course, people are going back and forth about what the CAI, what its implications are, whether that's, recoverable and so forth. But I think there's real and acute pressure or expectation. In fact, it's not pressure, interestingly enough, because I think Secretary Austin and President Biden have been pretty basically taking the pedal off the gas on the burden sharing issue, which would be one way of, but I think in the idea of trying to align that sort of era of good feelings, and we'll all get together and take on the techno-authoritarians. Now, let me go into my alternative. I don't think this is going to work. And I think speaking to my friends at FRS is probably, well, I don't know, some will agree, some won't. But I don't think, for a variety of reasons, I mean, I don't think states in general are likely to embark on essentially a global ideological alignment of interests. I mean, I think it matters whether a country is democracy or not, but I think it's sort of hard for me to imagine Europe having been much more clear that it will not sign on fully to a full-scale alignment with China. Now, my view is I've kind of, this is more acute in the case of the Germans, who have pined for the return of the traditional transatlantic style than it probably is for France, where there's obviously more of a kind of, a strong strain of independent autonomy or what have you, obviously a fraught term. My view is I've kind of gone through the stages of grief with Germany on this, and I've come out the other side resigned. And I think it's not realistic to expect Germany or the European Union, or let alone Italy and Spain and Portugal, to align more fully with us. I mean, I think there are areas where our interests certainly align, and that will primarily be in the economic sphere, technology, et cetera, generating scale. I'm happy to go into that. But my sense is our overall strategy would be better off focusing on working with countries where their interests more directly align with us and where their capabilities are most acute. I mean, there's very little Europe can do to affect the military balance in the Pacific. It's great that occasionally a French or German frigate does a presence operation in the Southeast China Sea. I'm not denigrating that. But really what would be most useful is to allow the United States to focus on Asia. And I am a regionalist on this point, because I think China's first goal, and essentially its only necessary objective, is to establish regional dominance in Asia. Because once it does that, it will have a position of predominance sufficient to be globally preeminent. At that point, they will be in a predominant position over half of global GDP. And that, as somebody said to me in Hanoi a few years ago, it's easy to see that, it's easy to talk about that strategy. It's hard to figure out what to do about it. But it's very clear in Asia that that's what they're going for. So my thing is that the Americans are absolutely critically necessary in Asia. nobody else can play that role. Obviously, the Japan alliance, Taiwan, South Korea, India, but we really need to focus there, in particular in the security domain. Our military line of effort needs to go there. And what I worked on in the Trump administration, national defense strategy, was really trying to push that focus towards China in Asia. And then we would essentially shift away from Europe. Obviously, we would continue the NATO commitment, but our military contributions at any given time, and in the event of a conflict, actually would be considerably more limited. Certainly in the Middle East, where I think we should draw down significantly. And then Europe would take a leading role in areas, of course, the European neighborhood itself, and with, I underscore, an American security guarantee still present, as well as in the Middle East and North Africa area. And then, I think that would stand on its own, but we would help, then I think it would be in our interest to help Europe as much as possible to generate that capability and scale. So I think there are two, that's not the model that's being tried right now. The Biden administration model is obviously the one that's being tried right now. We should know more within a year. And I mean, I think there being, the president said no reductions in our forces in Europe. The Pentagon and others have signaled at minimum delay, if not a cancellation of the drawdown in Afghanistan, as well as other parts of the Middle East. So we are pursuing a continued global approach with not really a regional focus approach, while saying that China, Russia, Iran, et cetera, continue to be threats. My point to my French friends and
Elbridge,
colleagues.
can I ask you to wind up?
Yeah, sure. Let me just make this last point. My point to my French colleagues would be, I think my approach is actually more consistent with what, or the long scope of French foreign policy, but actually would be very compatible with a much greater sort of degree of European autonomy is fraught, but certainly lead in decision-making. I think the deal here is that Europe would essentially overall align with the United States, and Bruno and I get in fights about this, but I don't mean align sort of slavishly or deferring in all cases, but I mean basically work with the United States to generate scale and efficiency and capability vis-a-vis the overall challenge from China, including by taking burdens off of the United States. And then in exchange, the United States should defer more to European political interests, including within Europe, as well as in regional areas, things like Pasco, et cetera. So we're not there now, but we may get there in the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Just a little one word of comment. In 2020, China became the European Union's largest trading partner. That sort of makes it a bit difficult to follow slavishly, whatever may be the convergence of values, interests, and so on. And this comes from a China hawk, by the way. Over to Bart Szewczyk. Bart actually was with us about a month ago to present a book which he had co-authored called Partners of First Resort, America, Europe, and the Future.
Now in paperback, available in stores near you.
You had it ready. You're a pro. So on today's session, let's listen to what your vision is on the future of the relationship.
Great, thanks so much, François. And let me echo Bridges. Thanks to both Xavier and Mark Toner and Carisa, as well as you, François, for hosting us today. Listen, just one quick caveat on your point, François, about China being the largest trading partner for the EU. That actually applies only to trading in goods. But actually, if you look into trade in goods and services, the transatlantic relationship is still predominant, and most of the growth will be in services rather than shipping goods across each other's borders. But small caveat. Look, I think the title of today's panel is on the Transatlantic Security Agenda, and it sounded like from Bridges' remarks that that agenda is relatively limited to sort of let each other go their own way, and the US will focus on China in Asia, and Europe will mend to its own neighborhood in Russia and the Middle East and North Africa. And I think it's a dangerous path to follow, but I think it's also a natural sort of logic to fall into, because we're in a pretty bad state right now after the past 4 years of really acrimonious rhetoric from the Trump administration against, calling the EU a foe, NATO is obsolete, being quite, assertive to a number of European countries and leaders without much purpose or rationale behind the rhetoric, but in a very kind of caustic tone. And in some ways, those past 4 years have reverberated to the present day. And so you hear a lot of European leaders and officials say, it's great that we have the Biden-Harris team, potentially the most transatlanticist administration in the US in decades, but we don't know what will come in 4 or 8 years. And so, we're going to live in the fear of the future, and we're still shell-shocked from the past 4 years. And so, maybe we should double down on European autonomy and hedging our bets, essentially. And I think Bridge alluded to this a little bit by pointing at President Macron's remarks in a number of speeches where, he has presented a strategic vision where Europe would be sort of a balancer against other great powers such as Russia, China, and the United States, and essentially treating all three as more or less equivalent. Now, he hedges that analysis in other parts of the speech or in other speeches where he says, well, obviously we share a lot more in common in terms of values with the United States, but still he, sticks to his guns and views, the France's role or Europe's role as a little bit of a mediator, a balancer in the kind of 19th century great power balance model. And I think that's the wrong way for Europe to go down. And it's also the wrong way for the US to pursue. And luckily, I don't think that's the thinking of the Biden-Harris team's strategy, but I see how we could fall into that trap. And let me just give you a quick overview of why I think that's the wrong path and lay out a potentially better vision. And the better vision is essentially that to recognize that over the past 7 decades, essentially, both the United States and a number of European countries have been able to preserve the values that they care about at home, their values of democracy, human rights, rule of law, and market capitalism, by broadening this concept of the West, broadening this community of liberal order in numbers, even as each individual part of this larger community maybe was experiencing economic decline. So if you look at the numbers in 1945, the US and the UK essentially dominated, collectively, reflecting something like half of global GDP and 3/4 of military spending. By 1950, that decreased a little bit, but still, they were able to command more or less half of global GDP and half of global military spending because they were able to enlarge their allies and their partners through institutions like NATO in 1949. Fast forwarding a little bit, several decades, you see how even as individual countries like France or the UK or Germany or Italy have decreased in relative economic weight. By the way, the US share has stayed more or less the same between 1950 and the current day, about a quarter, anywhere between 20% and 25%. But even as individual countries have decreased their economic share, they've grown the community. And now, you can speak to something like the West because you have NATO, because you have allies, US allies, and defense arrangements with Japan, Australia, and South Korea. And I think the main question for us now is how to deploy this alliance and these partnerships to serve our common purposes and common challenges, and in a way to redefine interests and common interests for our day, rather than sort of taking them as a given and somehow assuming that German and French interests in relation to China or Asia are somehow inherently divergent from US interests. And so, it takes a little bit of an act of statecraft and reimagination, but in a way it's inescapable because we need each other as partners of first resort to be able to deal with some of these challenges. And let me make another point, which is that, you know, if this was all about military competition with China, then perhaps Bridges' analysis would have greater force, because it is true that, you know, it is the United States that's militarily present in Asia and is likely to be in the near term future. You know, although France might have some presence in the UK and even now Germany, you know, all that pales in comparison. And so perhaps if it was just military competition, then you would, you know, sort of place your money only on US activity. But in fact, you know, any competition over the long term with China will be multifaceted and will encompass economics, technology, diplomacy across the board. And so there, you know, take an example like 5G, it matters tremendously whether European countries adopt Huawei's 5G technology in their own home countries to determine, you know, who's going to prevail on that specific technology, or likewise on, you know, other technologies in AI and elsewhere. And so that's why actually the European front is as important as Asia, because the competition is much more multifaceted. Likewise, if you talk about, you know, diplomatic competition, one thing that China has been relatively effective at is, you know, basically working with anyone without any preconditions or criteria to then, you know, set up some commercial projects through the Belt and Road Initiative or other arrangements. And once, you know, they establish that economic foothold, by the way, could you vote on our behalf, you know, in the UN or on this issue or that issue in an international institution? And so quietly, diplomatically, they're able to expand the reach. And again, some of the competition will occur in that arena, not only in Asia, but across the world. And there, if you're talking about diplomatic competition, partners like those in Europe, as well as Australia, Japan, and South Korea will be very important. And let me maybe close with a final note on the EU-China deal, which I agree with Bridge. You know, it sort of came at a weird moment and it sounded a little bit anomalous to the overall positive tone towards the Biden-Harris administration from European leaders. And I'm still trying to wrap my mind around, you know, the fact that in December of last year, at the beginning of the month, you had this essentially love letter from the European Commission and the European External Action Service to the new Biden-Harris team, laying out, you know, a long list of joint proposals to do things together. And only 4 weeks later, you had this agreement in principle with China, which, if you look into the text and the underlying rationale, is essentially a commercial agreement that recognizes that, you know, it's not going to change China's political behavior or internal arrangements, and is mainly driven to sell more cars and other things that Germany and other European countries produce, without any of these wider long-term considerations for what that means vis-a-vis the United States, and also vis-a-vis the wider, you know, competition with China. And there, you know, I think the reason why you had this anomaly, two sort of incoherent decisions within a single month, is because you don't have a full kind of strategic fleshing out of various considerations and pros and cons across different issues among European leaders. You have a piecemeal approach that generates these piecemeal outcomes. And it's striking that, you know, the EU is right now going through this strategic compass review, which is supposed to be a follow-up to the 2016 EU global strategy. But now 14 months into it, apparently it hasn't even discussed the issue of the rise of China and probably also the threats from Russia. And instead is, you know, is sort of a technocratic exercise on functional issues of wider kind of promotion of multilateralism, that sort of thing, but without sort of tackling challenges and threats and opportunities directly. Whereas in contrast, you know, you have the Biden-Harris team coming in, and within 6 weeks, they produce an interim strategic guidance on national security, which is, as Bridge pointed out, quite frank and clear-headed. And so what I would hope that we could achieve together, although I would concede that we're starting from a relatively low point after the past 4 years, is to have kind of a joint approach to some of these issues between Europe and America, because I still think we're each other's partners of first resort, as well as Asian or partners in Asia, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, and others, to be able to kind of dig deeper into exactly what we're trying to accomplish, and to recognize that we're only going to be able to accomplish those things together.
Okay, thank you very much, Bart. Just to reassure you on the trading front, America's largest supplier in terms of trade of goods is China, by the way. So the situation is in some ways comparable to that of the European Union. The basic point that I want to make is that China is not the Soviet Union. It's in some ways more difficult to handle. Over to Carisa. You heard both sides of the discussion. I assume you also have your own views, and we'd all be very interested for you to share them with us. And we have plenty of questions from the audience also, which some of which may surprise some of you. Okay, Carisa, over to you.
Excellent. Again, would just like to echo my thanks to all of you for hosting this today, and to Bart and Bridge for a lot of food for thought and a little bit of clash. So that should be very exciting. I will say, in terms of my own intervention, I think that there is a key and pivotal role for NATO in addressing the China challenge. And I think that there are two trends that we'll see emerge in the next couple of years. Both mostly surrounding emerging and disruptive technology. The first thing is I would advocate that we'll need to enhance NATO-EU cooperation in order to come to any kind of agreement to both protect as well as jointly innovate in the technology space. So with an adversary, to use the American parlance, a competitor, to use rhetoric on both sides of the Atlantic, like China, who is advancing a military civil fusion strategy and is intentionally blurring those lines between military issues and interests as well as economic and commercial issues and interests, is going to require NATO to get a little uncomfortable, a little outside of its traditional bailiwick. I think that this will primarily be done by NATO setting the risk assessments, having a seat at the table at the EU to be able to convey what are the military equities in those issues. As Bart pointed out, issues like 5G, and if we even look to export control regimes, how do we stem the flow of Dutch ASML's photolithographic technology that they need to develop cutting-edge semiconductors. So as we think about these issues moving forward, it will require deeper and greater collaboration between NATO and the EU in order to address this. Another issue that is also part of all of this that has been a little on the fray, on the outside of the conversation, has been the role of privacy and some transatlantic tensions in these issues. I think we're actually going to see a huge emergence of privacy being an issue in transatlantic security. Things that we don't necessarily think of as, NATO being a regulatory power, having a seat at the table in these conversations. And I think that because of the challenge that China presents in artificial intelligence, how they're innovating, how they're using, the West's intellectual property to do that and to leapfrog technology, this is going to require NATO to have a seat at the table in regulatory conversations. So I think that this is another one of those issues that we really risk hobbling NATO interoperability without having greater and deeper cooperation between NATO and the EU, especially to address the China challenge and to get on the same page about privacy, and then finally to jointly innovate together, to work through NATO's defense planning process to identify those military gaps and to work together. So, I sort of take half of an approach of Bridge that, maybe the role for NATO is to really focus on Russia, but I do think there are these issues, much like Bart, where the actors are, NATO's going to have a seat at the table to discuss the China challenge. And there is a role specifically in the economic and tech arenas that NATO traditionally has not taken a very active role in, where they're going to need to step up and be a part of that broader conversation. So that's kind of just to bridge the two perspectives there, sort of how I envision NATO's role moving forward. But one question that I have for both of you is on the democratic backsliding piece. So I can maybe guess how Bridge would respond to this, but I am especially curious, Bart's perspective. If the Biden administration strategy is a foreign policy based on regime type, and the focus is really working with democracies, what are we to do about NATO allies who are backsliding, like Poland, Hungary, Turkey? What's the play there? And how do we balance upholding NATO's values and committing to those values, but also upholding NATO cohesion, which I think are maybe mutually exclusive in some ways. So I'm very curious to hear from both of you, your perspectives on what NATO should do on the backsliding question, and if that's at all a liability to the strategy that's being advanced by the Biden-Harris administration.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And if I may, I would like to add to your question a companion question to both of you, and that is, well, President Biden has laid out a vision of a liberal order based on a reunion of democracies. I'm all in favor. I like it. I belong to democracy. I'd like to see everybody become a democracy. But that is an order in which China doesn't actually have a legitimate place. How do you fit China into an order in which it is essentially told you are not going to be a rule maker because you're not liberal and you're not a democracy? So basically, doesn't that mean that there is a challenge which is being thrown by the US to China, at least as much, if not more, than by China, by virtue of its rise, does to the democracies? So why don't you step in first, Elbridge, and then Bart, and then we'll move to the audience. Sure. No, really good, rich presentations. Not my place to judge, but I think a lot to talk about. Just on these two questions, happy to elaborate on the other ones. I mean, I think NATO's purpose is a security alliance to defend its member states, and so internal considerations should largely be driven by cohesion, and the ability to whether countries are stepping up to their defense responsibilities. Obviously, NATO's had countries that have the Greek coup and Portugal and so forth and so on. That's not something that obviously democracy is written into the original Washington Treaty, but I don't think that should be something that NATO gets deeply into in my view. But I think the broader point is less acute in Europe. It's going to be very acute in Asia, and this relates to something that Bart was talking about, which I don't want to go on too long. But I mean, the countries that are going to be critical for balancing China and Asia a lot of them are in South and Southeast Asia and are not democracies or imperfect democracies, and that's I think that brings up the question that François was referring to, and I mean, yeah, I agree with you, François. I mean, my view is that we should get to a point of a sustainable balance of power with China, whether it's democratic or not, but that we should not be. And I personally, I would just ditch the rules-based international order stuff. I know Europeans love it and stuff, but I think it's really distorting our thinking at this point. We need to get much more back into thinking about the balance of power, and we've really lost practice. Not present company accepted, but we've lost practice over the last generation. Mm-hmm. Bart.
So on Carisa's very good points, look, I think it is going to be a challenge for NATO, and one that should be on the agenda, because I agree with Bridge that it's primarily a security organization in the military alliance, but ultimately, it's built around certain political values of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law, which is written into the Washington Treaty. And we really need to make sure that we pay attention to these things in each other's countries. Now, what to do about it is a more difficult question. I don't think anything that NATO Secretary General or even the alliance writ large can say or do in the short term, will reverse the trends in Hungary or Poland or elsewhere. But it should be on the agenda. It should be raised as an issue because ultimately, we have this alliance for a particular purpose, and the particular purpose is to defend our way of life, which is based around these common values. And if we lose sight of that, then I think we're going to be in trouble. Of course, not all the NATO member states at the time of joining were full democracies, but we never saw this much backsliding after joining, and it should be an issue for the alliance. And it's an issue for the EU as well. Now, on François' point about liberal order and how does China fit in, you have different levels of order, which, if I may just plug in another book on European strategy, you need to think in several different levels. So you have the liberal order, which basically encompasses, Europe, America, Japan, Australia, and South Korea, and maybe a number of other countries. And then you have the wider international order, some of which is, liberally oriented, and some of which is not. Obviously, during the Cold War, you had a basic standoff between the Western liberal order and the Soviet illiberal order, as it were. And these ideas, I agree with Bridge, can get sometimes confusing and conflated. But I think they also help define, what we're trying to achieve and protect within a specific geographic region. And then going, across the world, what are we trying to accomplish? And so, for instance, with China, as well as Russia and other illiberal states, obviously there are still some common challenges that we can work together on. First and foremost, climate. Europe and America are not going to be able to resolve the climate crisis, even with a number of Asian allies and partners, if China is not on board, if Russia is not on board. And so obviously that's an issue that's paradigmatic of the need for global action. Global health is another issue where you basically need to make sure that everyone's on board, especially China, because anything that Europe and America and others try to do together is not going to be sufficient in the era of global travel, and where viruses don't really discriminate between your domestic political regime. But having said that, there's some things that we can protect and should protect together as a transatlantic community, and those things will be defined more in values terms. And I think we can, walk and chew gum at the same time. We can realize that there are some things that we'll do on our own, and some things that we'll need to work with other liberal states on.
Thank you very much. On the World Health front, of course, what we have seen is exactly the opposite of what you suggest in the framework of the world's biggest pandemic for 1 century. So the notion that you're going to be able to co-opt China on global warming on our terms maybe a bit of a stretch.
Let me just push back on that, because the reason why we got the Paris Climate Agreement in 2016 is because President Obama and President Xi Jinping were able to forge a bilateral deal that then served as the cornerstone for the wider Paris Climate Agreement. So I think you still are going to have the driver of collective action within the United States and Europe, as well as being able to bring some of these other countries on board, including China and Russia. And on global health, whatever ultimate arrangement that we reach that will be sustainable will include, obviously, Russia's and China's participation, and this will be on collectively designed terms. But that's not to underappreciate the fact that some things we'll need to do on our own, because we'll have certain common values and common interests that we want to defend on our own.
But China has become bigger, it has become arrogant, it has become tougher. It now expects to be a rule shaper, not a rule maker with others. 2016 was 2016. 2021 is the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party. So I'm paradoxically less optimistic than you are about our ability to work with China.
But look,
let me get into the questions, if I may.
But just 30 seconds on this point. We still command a lot of power. Don't forget that. The US plus Europe plus Australian and Japan and South Korea.
I'm not saying that we are disappearing. I'm saying China is stronger and nastier than it used to be.
We still command 60% of global GDP and 60% of military spending, and probably of the diplomatic weight, if not more. Yeah. And so we have a lot of strengths that we can play too. And China is not 10 feet tall, as one recent article said.
Yeah, but it's the only one which is really growing 1 foot per year, if I can put it that way. And that is a problem. It really is. The questions, and the 2 questions I'll treat as one here, and they're actually about the European role and the combination between Europe and the US vis-a-vis China. And they're both in contradiction with the sort of, we do China, you do Russia vision, which was laid out earlier by Elbridge. One question is on Indo-Pacific, what would be a valuable contribution of the Europeans in the military domain? What do you think of the increasing security ties between European countries and partnerships in the region? And as mentioned here, the French-Australian partnership, but you could add the British-Japanese, the French-Japanese, French-Indian, and so on. And the companion question to that is, how could the US and the EU collaborate to deal with the presence and the influence of China and Russia in Africa, which is obviously an area of particular interest to Europe? So who wants to go first? Bart, Elbridge? Bart,
I'm happy to, because I think it relates to, maybe it gives me a chance to respond to some of the things that Bart has said. Thanks for the questions, François. I mean, I think this gets at a broader question, which Bart touched on a number of times, which I do think is a fundamental source of difference between what you might call the kind of liberal Biden, and I mean capital L, Biden approach, and this more sort of realpolitik one that I'm showing, which is how salient is the military dimension. And I try to find it in print. I don't see it that often, but it's definitely in the air, which is a lot of people saying China is an economic and cultural, informational or whatever, but not a military threat. And I have a very different view for a couple of reasons, which, there's obviously people on my side as well. But I think a couple of things. One is that, China's goals I don't think are military expansion, but its proximate goal, according to the US government and others, is first regional hegemony and then global preeminence, global leadership, as Admiral Davidson said yesterday. The problem that they're facing is that they will not be able to attain that without using very sharp forms of pressure. Now we see right now that they're using this kind of against Australia and Taiwan, but today Bloomberg reports pineapple sales for Taiwan are up. So, the economic forms of coercion, as we have found over the last generation, are more, say, with Cuba or North Korea or what have you, are very limited in their efficacy when you're really trying to put pressure on somebody else. China is now, if China is serious about pursuing its regional and ultimately global interests, it will have to have a credible military instrument, and that is what it is, and put real intense pressure. And that's where the other difference I have, Bart, is it's true in some IISS military balance form that we have 60%, but that is not necessarily going to be allocated efficiently. As we found, we lost the war in Vietnam. We were 1,000,000 times stronger than the Vietnamese, but we didn't have the resolve and the right strategy and so forth. And by the way, all our friends didn't come in then either. And I'm not crying about it. I'm just saying it's a fact that we have to deal with. So the key is that we have to meet their strategy with a strategy that will work and will carry water and that people will actually go into. So the fundamental response is, I think it's great if the Europeans occasionally send forces through the Pacific, but contrary to what François was suggesting, it is better if you focus at home because that's where your forces are really capable. And I've said this to the Brits as well, sending their new aircraft carrier through the Pacific every once in a while doesn't do anything. Who's going to support it? Who's going to do the logistics? Who's going to do the air defense? They actually have to borrow F-35s from us to put it on the aircraft carrier. Not bashing my British friends, but I'm just saying, look, let's be realistic. Your competitive advantage and where your interests are really engaged are in Europe. I agree with Carisa about the technology thing. We need economic and technology scale and standard setting scale. I totally get that. But, that's going to, the WHO and stuff, those are going to be the fora of competition. The climate issue, they're going to be determined, they're going to be a product or derivative of the great power competition. I think partnerships are good. I think the best thing is a division of labor, and that's true with Europe, it's true with India, et cetera. The best thing that Europe can do, and particularly France, in the Indo-Pacific, is in a contingency, say, over Taiwan, which is, you know, as Admiral Davidson is saying, is an issue right now and will increase over this decade, especially if we don't resource PDI, Pacific Deterrence Initiative, is for Europe to prepare for, I would say, support to US and potentially other operations, particularly in the event of a blockade attempt, where European efforts to relieve an economic blockade or a military blockade, or deter Chinese attempts to escalate a conflict horizontally to other theaters, would meet with a European presence. So essentially, you'd have a backfilling role, and as well as handling the potential for opportunistic aggression in a second theater, not only Europe, but also potentially in the Middle East, where US forces are going to have to go to the central front, which is basically the first island chain, as the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy pointed out, and which I think the Biden administration is continuing. I mean, the Biden administration said the commitment to Taiwan is rock solid. I've never heard language like that. It didn't come out of the Trump administration. Rock solid is, never heard something like that. That's pretty strong. I mean, you have to go back to when we had formal relations with Taipei to get something like that. So I think the best thing that Europe can do, and by the way, I think it's consistent with, again, more moderate. I think third polism will be a disaster for all of us, because if an attempt to create a third pole will necessarily and reasonably be read in Washington as a distancing from Washington, an attempt to undercut our effort vis-a-vis China. That will turn Europe into a forum for competition, a metaphorical battlefield between the superpowers. But what I'm saying by not non-slavish, I was differentiating myself from that, is rather an alignment overall, generating scale in the ways that Carisa is talking about. And then in return, the U.S. supports the European position more on a range of issues. But I think this idea that you know, and by the way, the Chinese are not going to be materially deterred by an occasional European ship going through the Pacific. So I think it's this kind of divide regional approach is going to be much more effective.
Mm-hmm. That's very clear. I'm not sure you will have convinced everybody, but it is very clear. That is a system. That is a vision.
That's all I can do.
No, that's fine. Bart, your take.
Look, I think the danger of a division of labor, and sometimes it's voiced also in Europe, so you have these ideas here as well, is that over time it will lead to a divergence of perceived interest and a divergence of where we head, both as Europe and as the United States. And I think, you know, we have to remember that, for instance, during the Korean War, there were a number of European countries that participated significantly in that effort. And likewise, you know, over the past 20 years in Afghanistan, European allies as part of NATO have been central in supporting US efforts there. So I wouldn't count out the ability of European countries to contribute to wider common challenges, and you know, their willingness to do so and their ability to do so will be higher if they perceive a common strategic threat from or challenge from China as it is in the United States. And you don't get there if you just say, okay, you deal with Russia, we deal with China. Secondly, you know, if you're frank, Europe can't deal so on its own with Russia because of its relatively limited defense capabilities. Size, you know, they're significant collectively, but if you talk about the number of nuclear weapons and, you know, get into all those considerations, I mean, you know, the U.S. role is central to European security, and so it's a little bit, you know, too far-fetched to say, okay, you deal with Russia and other regional issues, and we'll deal with Asia. I wanted to also pick up on one point that, and it gets to some of the questions in the Q&A that Chris made about broadening NATO's agenda to include, you know, China, maybe climate and public health and so forth. And I think that it's a natural intuition because basically you want a large membership to deal with a broader set of issues. But in some ways, you know, NATO is good because of its crystal clear mission as a security alliance, as a military alliance. And if you have, you know, finance ministers and public health officials meeting in NATO councils, you could do it, but it would potentially dilute the impact that NATO has. And so what I'm thinking actually is a new institution, something that's fit for our common challenges of today, that would bring together all NATO member states as well as all EU member states, and potentially Japan, South Korea, and Australia, as a way of both having an inclusive membership and a broader agenda, because I think our current arrangements are not really fit for purpose. And in some ways, the EU-China deal, at the same time as the love letter to the Biden-Harris administration, illustrates the fact that we need a slightly better institutional format to reach common decisions.
Thank you, Bart, and thank you in particular for having mentioned the Europe versus Russia angle, because there were a couple of questions about that. So you've actually answered a couple of other questions in the process. I'd like before we close, I'd like to turn. I haven't given her any advance warning, but I'd like to turn towards Carisa to see where she stands after this discussion on essentially two visions, one which I would call the risk-sharing vision, and the other one which is the division of labor vision. Of course, the world is more complicated than that, and there will be shades of both in whatever happens. But still, these are two different models. So, Carisa, if you could chip in, and then we'll wind up.
Sure. So I naturally have always gravitated a little bit more to the division of labor model. But that said, the very large caveat is that to protect NATO allies from China's influence in ways that can hobble NATO mobility. I mean, if we think about if China is building the Belgrade to Budapest railway and it has the wrong kinds of gauges, and now, suddenly this can't be used at all for any kind of NATO mobility, this obviously presents a challenge and a risk to NATO. So I guess my massive caveat is that there does need to be, maybe it's an organization, a lot of like what Bart said, that's kind of a NATO EU Council or NATO Indo-Pacific Council to look at this. But I do think there is a critical role for NATO at the table just to protect NATO interoperability, NATO mobility, and to ensure that this is something that China can't impede in the future. In terms of actual capabilities, military capabilities in the Indo-Pacific, I do tend to gravitate a little bit more towards that model of divide and conquer. There are a lot of analysts who are saying that the occasional French frigate does send a political message that, Europe is ready and this is a deterrent to China in some ways that we can establish as a transatlantic relationship. I know that this is maybe a little bit of an unfair question because there's no magical number of frigates, but I am curious kind of how much would Europe need to ramp up its capabilities and presence in the Indo-Pacific to actually create that deterrence? Or is it enough to have the occasional frigate from Germany, France, the UK in the Indo-Pacific to really send that message of transatlantic resolve and cohesion?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we will end on that question because that would launch us into another session. I would add that is my own little moment for self-advertising. I did a piece in Survival in the IISS journal in the spring of last year about how NATO could indeed play a COCOM type role vis-a-vis technology transfers and Chinese investment. Some of that has actually found its way into the NATO 2030 report. So, first of all, thank you all. Thank you for the very direct manner in which you've answered the question. Thank you to the participants. Well, to just in one sentence, this is going to be a very, very difficult act that we're going to have to get into over the next 20, 30 years. The penalties for getting it wrong will be very high. There is a lot of reason to be highly deliberative about this. Now that the general point, I think, is clear to all. I mean, the pandemic served that purpose. The pandemic has displayed China as the other superpower. If there was only one geopolitical effect of the pandemic, that was it. They are not 20 feet tall, but they're certainly not the responsible stakeholders that we were dealing with at the G20 meetings in 2008, 2009, when they helped us dig ourselves out of the great financial crisis.
I would quibble with the COVID showing China as a superpower. In some ways, they were the source of the initial problem, and they haven't really been a part of the global solution. And in many ways, what the pandemic has shown is, if the United States gets its act together, it can be a real, solution to these types of problems, because many of the vaccines are actually produced in the United States. You see that now with the Biden-Harris team, rapid vaccination rates across the board. You also see it obviously in the United Kingdom. In Europe, it's a slower pace, but in some ways, we've responded to this now much more effectively than China has, even in terms of vaccinating people, the number of vaccinations per capita. And so I'm a little bit more optimistic about our ability to meet these challenges together. But I think we will only be successful if we do approach these issues together, rather than sort of going our separate ways and dealing with them on our own.
Okay. I will substitute to François. We're in the same building, but basically we don't have the same connection, I guess. Anyway, I would like to thank you, and as François said, for your very kind and very, I would say, frank discussions we have had about these very, very important issues. It's very fruitful for us. Us as FRS, we're thinking a lot about these issues, and having you, I would say, thinking with us about this future is very important. So thank you to all. Thank you, Bart. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Carisa, for giving this particular note and focusing on this very, very interesting and important issues. It was a great event in my mind, and a very good first, I would say. And I hope, Mark, we share my view on this. And very, very welcome for doing this again. We have had a large audience. I think it has fascinated people. I looked at the questions, and the audience was very attentive, I think, to what you said. So thank you very much. It was a great moment, and I think it's very important for us to pursue this in the future and work out a new way of thinking the things. So thank you to all. Thank you for having listened to us, and so have a good day, and we'll be in touch anyway on these issues. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Merci.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.